think most of you who are watching are probably familiar with the Institute. We're a nonprofit think tank active in public policy, research, litigation, focused on fighting for individual liberty and limited government. And when it comes to education, that means fighting for parents, their ability to choose the best education for them, making sure they have the options available to them. I'm lucky today to be joined by Jenny Clark, the founder and executive director of Love Your School, an organization that was launched this last year, also dedicated to celebrating and promoting school choice options, educational opportunities for Arizona families, everything from traditional district schools to public charter schools, privates, homeschooling, and more. As we dive into our conversation today around education, I just want to recognize you, Jenny, especially for the valuable perspective that I think you bring. In addition to being the executive director of Love Your School, that's only one of several hats that you wear, being a mother, I believe, of 5 who's actively involved with the individualized education of your kids, so even before the COVID outbreak. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we do jump into things, I would just like to encourage folks who are watching to submit questions. We will have time for a Q&A afterwards. If you'd like to submit a question, you can send an email to us at events@goldwaterinstitute.org, or also give us a call at 602-633-8975. So with that, we'll jump right in. Jenny, it's obviously an unprecedented time that we're looking at right now. Campuses are closed across the country. Kids are engaged in remote learning, and parents, teachers, school administrators, everybody's sort of learning on the fly. And so I'm curious your take, before we look at the kind of big picture, what that has looked like sort of on the ground in your experience and in your household.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so just a little background to share. I grew up in Arizona, and I went to Arizona public schools from kindergarten to 12th grade and then on to the U of A. And now fast forward, 20 years, time flies. I'm a mom of 5, and I realized something that I never expected, having grown up going to public schools, and that's that, when it comes to education, one size does not fit all, right? So in Arizona, we are just so incredibly lucky to have so many different options for our children, whether it's district, charter, private, online, homeschool, and now for our family right now, an empowerment scholarship. So, for us, even prior to COVID-19, we really had the ability to be immersed in a more flexible, individualized form of education for our kids, 2 of whom are dyslexic and dysgraphic. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about, ESA later on in the conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. But for now, I think it's important to share just that the challenges that were brought on by COVID-19 and the transition in education for families, the upheaval of the routine and structure, those types of challenges were lessened a lot for our family because of the ESA. And that's something that I certainly do not take, for granted. We are just so thankful for that. So, for our family, a couple of our therapies stopped earlier than normal, but we were able to deal with so many different things, I think, very quickly and creatively because we had access to that program.
Wonderful. So, yeah, taking that experience and looking a little bit more broadly, obviously there has been turbulence and challenges, not only that moms like you have experienced, but just in general. So I'm thinking perhaps we could talk a little about what have been some of these commonalities and contrasts. We've seen some schools and states that have handled this, very creative responses, others that have fumbled it a little bit more. And so, I might propose that one of the differences that we've seen is really between those school systems and those states that have taken kind of a student-centric model, really trying to focus on adaptability, flexibility, versus those that have been sort of more entrenched in kind of institutional or bureaucratic types of thinking. We saw early on in the pandemic, places like the Philadelphia public schools issuing a letter to teachers telling them they're not to instruct any of their students because they weren't confident that they could instruct all students. Really sort of out of greater concern for checking a box for federal compliance than for making sure they could serve students to the best ability possible. On the flip side, that we also had a lot of school districts doing really creative and innovative things, retooling school buses so that they could send them out with wireless internet for those students who may not have had access to that. So I think we've seen, some of the good and the bad. And so I'm curious your thought on this, schools that you've seen and your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I really think that I've seen schools do some amazing innovation. I mean, early for Love Your School, we really tried to interview as many people as we could that were involved kind of in the education sphere. And of course, we kind of focused on Arizona. And we just had a neat opportunity to interview one of the principals at Canyon View High School, which is a brand new, beautiful public district school out on the west side. And the principal said that their transition really wasn't as difficult maybe as some other schools. Of course, there were challenges, but so much of their education and communication had already been online that they were really well prepared. He even talked about something that I just loved, and that was that he utilized Facebook Live for his families. He said, you know, people really like the live option. They can ask questions right away. Most people have Facebook. And I just thought, wow, you know, a principal utilizing Facebook Live to better connect with students and families. So just some of those types of, you know, little things, but there's still an avenue of innovation and communication are just, I think, really neat and are putting us in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And, you know, you talked about Canyon View here in Arizona, and speaking more broadly, you know, the state, when our legislature passed its emergency coronavirus legislation, it required that all schools continue to provide, you know, educational services to students if they're going to continue receiving funding. And so you contrast that with other areas where maybe you didn't have instruction continuing to take place at that same level. And, you know, looking at the other side of the country, you know, one of the success stories that I've seen that I really thought was really extraordinary, Success Academy charter schools in New York, you know, they serve about 20,000 students, predominantly low-income minority students. And when they switched over to their online, they reported a 97% attendance rate that first week. They had their teachers, you know, calling students twice a day, checking in on them, even ended up sharing sort of as a model for other district schools. And really, I think, kind of driving that home, just doing a fantastic job.
Yeah, and I love that sharing, right? Because it's this new collaboration, I think, that we're seeing in education. And while collaborating is nothing inherently new, I think we're seeing a greater openness, you know, a willingness to embrace the resources of others. It's not, well, we have to come up with this. It has to have our name. It has to be our idea. It's let's look at what is out there and what is the best that's out there, and let's utilize that for students and for families. I've seen, you know, just some online schools, for example, sharing lots of content from other places, from other schools, or even, you know, just from museums and universities and those types of things. And it's all with the intent to help families.
Right. Yeah, those are fantastic stories. Switching gears a little bit on that, you know, one of the questions that's come up a lot is sort of what is going to be the long-term impact? You know, we've seen kind of parents and everybody adjusting now, but sort of what's going to be the impact that COVID-19 is likely to have on educational freedom going forward, you know, positive trends and concerns that are looming. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well. But, you know, starting with some of the concerns, you know, we've seen obviously with kind of the economic turmoil of everything going on and financial uncertainty or insecurity, especially for things like private schools, which are dependent upon tuition payments, you know, families struggling, not sure if they can continue to make that, you know, paying tuition is already a sacrifice, and to do it in times like this, you know, especially difficult for many. And that obviously then translates to those schools which do depend on those tuition payments. You know, the folks over at the Cato Institute have been tracking, and they've found, you know, over 30 schools that have already announced permanent closures across the country, you know, for lack of tuition and enrollment that they're expecting, and obviously that's likely to increase. And that's thousands of students who, you know, are being displaced from that. And so you see a lot of challenges to kind of the idea of school choice and having these alternatives. But at the same time, you know, I do think that we're seeing the cases of you know, families beginning to kind of take note of thinking of education outside sort of the four walls of just their district school classroom. You know, you've had in some states, administrators even going out of their way to try and keep parents from exploring these. You know, you had charter operators that were offering to step up, and states like Oregon kind of coming out and saying, we're actually going to close off some of these pathways for students, sort of knowing that you could see a big shift there. And I think, you know, sort of the most telling thing that we've had is in some of the polling data that's come out recently. Yeah, I'm sure saw Real Clear Politics a few weeks ago with American Federation for Children came out and found, you know, 40% of parents were saying they were more likely to consider homeschooling in the wake of coronavirus. And then just yesterday, USA Today came out with a poll that was 6 in 10 parents being more likely to consider at-home learning, and I think 3 out of 10 saying they were very likely to do that. And so I think you do see a lot of that momentum.
Yeah, and I hope that we do that momentum and that we continue to see, you know, more opportunity and more innovation. Just this week, I had a chance to talk to a friend of mine who is a principal at a charter school, and he shared with me, you know, not just about opening up and kind of what their plans are for that, looking at alternate schedules and looking at some, online options for families who maybe are a little concerned about being there, 5 days a week. But he was also talking about ways to open up their facility certain times during the week for other families who are home educating. And that just really kind of blew my mind. And it was so encouraging and exciting, because to think that we have school leaders that are thinking about the different ways that they can meet the needs of kids, maybe not even kids that are enrolled at their school. That's just very, very exciting, very encouraging. And I just hope that that type of, opportunity and energy continues.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of that opportunity and the energy and looking at those ways to make that happen, obviously everybody has been adjusting to different sort of things right now. We've heard a lot about sort of crisis schooling, Corona schooling, in the news or elsewhere. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between, how that relates to sort of homeschooling. What are we seeing families doing now? Is that homeschooling? Kind of what's your take on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think like early on, there were, kind of some funny jokes and memes and things floating around social media with the ideas of, we're all homeschoolers now. And it was fun, and we all got a little bit of a chuckle. But I think it's important to differentiate between homeschooling and what we're seeing now. So just a little background kind of on homeschooling. Homeschooling is parent-led, and it occurs mostly at home, obviously, instead of a school. And, homeschooling has been around forever. Certainly in the United States has a very rich history. There's been ups and downs in the course of home education over the centuries. But for our purposes today, we can really talk about the current growth of homeschooling that's been continually trending upward really since the 1970s. I mean, as of 2019, we're looking at around 2.5 million homeschooled students, kinder to 12th grade in the United States. And there are a variety of reasons that parents choose to homeschool. Some of those are faith-based, and some of those are not. Because homeschoolers, don't normally receive state or federal funds, there is, of course, a savings to the taxpayer when families choose to home educate. And I just think that's something that's important to mention as well. But as many education leaders have already pointed out, the past several months, what families have really been doing right now is not what we understand to be traditional homeschooling. And the distinction is important because the circumstances surrounding the current schooling situation are just so extremely difficult and complex for a variety of different reasons. So first, it's not parent-led like traditional homeschooling because you have an intermediary, right? You have the school. It's difficult to manage an entire school schedule for a child that someone else has set, and then to have to meet those really important deadlines and work expectations for your kids. And while also, in many cases, having to work from home yourself. So there's that challenge. And then there's the social and emotional challenges for kids. Those are completely different. Normally a child is staying home and a parent is home educating because that's what they've chosen to do. So in the current situation with crisis schooling, many kids were just, thrust back home very quickly, and their world changed pretty much overnight. So that's really difficult to process for kids and for parents. And to be honest, it's taken time for, I would say, a good majority of families to adjust and really navigate this time with kids. And I don't think that that's bad. I think that parents need to give themselves a lot of room to realize that they've done a really great job. And this is just something that none of us have really experienced before. So for those reasons and many others, what's really been happening is crisis schooling, and we just need to acknowledge the difficulty. We need to encourage parents who are struggling with how they did or how their kids did, now that school's kind of out for the summer. And just remember that this time, it has value. It's not value just in that they completed their work, that they did the problems, that they showed up to the Zoom classrooms. There's value in the time that was spent, in the things that were learned, and even in just the growth that happened, navigating through this for students and for parents. So that's kind of a long answer, but, it's kind of some important things in there and hopefully some encouragement for parents.
Yeah, and I think some great distinctions that you made there. And yes, I think encouraging words. As we talk about sort of the success stories and the encouragement, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of these things, in addition to just the kind of homeschooling we talked about. other sort of non-traditional models of education, sort of newer ideas, things like micro schools, co-ops that a lot of parents are starting to try. Can you talk a little about what these are, what sort of potential you see for them expanding, and go into that a little bit?
Absolutely. And these things are so kind of fun and exciting to talk about, I think, because they're so new. And it's neat to see all the things that are happening right now. So, one great example that I just love is micro schooling. So here in Arizona, we have one called Prenda. And at Love Your School, actually, we interviewed the founder, Kelly Smith, a few weeks back. And that was really neat. But basically, micro schools are just what they sound like. It's a smaller group of usually 5 to 10 students. You're in an in-home setting, so in person, led by mentors. And the mentors, they're not called teachers, they're called guides. So each day, these students, they set out goals and they collaborate on activities and projects, and it's all supported by the adult guide. In Arizona, the model is tuition-free for people outside of Arizona. There's some private models as well under Prenda, and there's probably going to be other micro-schooling organizations that are going to kind of come into the market here soon too. So just as an example, last year, Prenda had about 130 micro schools, and this fall they're expected to hit over 400 micro schools. So I think that already is, just a testament to parents looking for things that are different. They're looking for different options, and micro schooling might be an option, especially for families who need their child to go back to a regular Monday through Friday school setting because they have to work, but they want something that's a little bit smaller and they maybe have concerns about a larger environment. One other example I love is the university model. So these exist all over the United States. In Arizona, there's one in Tucson called Veritas Academy, and it's a private school which is classical in its curriculum also, but they have a university type schedule. And so it's a teacher-parent, what we call teacher-parent integrated instructional approach. So those are a lot of words, but basically depending on the child's age, the kids go to school 2, 3, or 4 days a week. And then the parent is the teacher at home on the other days. And of course, the school helps work with the parents and train the parents. But I think the university model is another great, option and potential opportunity as more schools open or look towards transitioning to that type of model if they can. And then, of course, all throughout the United States, we have incredible homeschool co-op opportunities. One that we were involved in years ago, which is all over the US, actually all over the world, is Classical Conversations. Classical Conversations is classical curriculum model, and basically they meet once a week. They use a teacher who's called a tutor, kind of like the guide with the micro schooling. And it's a great way for parents to get guided instruction for their kids, but then also a curriculum that's very clear and set and easy to implement for the parents. And then, of course, there's just hundreds of traditional homeschool co-ops all over the state. In Arizona, there's one called Branches, and they offer just a variety of different classes for students. And then another model, which is kind of like micro schooling, but it's only 1 day a week, is the cottage school model, or the one room schoolhouse type model. And that's where home educating families basically come together 1 day a week, and they choose what subjects or they choose the curriculum that they want to address 1 day a week. Our family has utilized some of this model under the Empowerment Scholarship. And one of the reasons why I really like it is because it allows families to utilize the skills and talents of other parents. So for example, the gal who teaches my kids, English right now, she is a professor, an English professor. The gal who teaches, science to my kids, she's a nurse. And so just different models, one room schoolhouse, cottage school, whatever it is, we're seeing a lot of neat new options. And it's my hope that parents who are searching will be able to find out, what those options are if they're looking to transition and consider what works best for their kids.
Well, you laid out a whole different menu of different options there. And I think that that's something that I feel a lot of parents aren't necessarily aware of, but I think as they become more familiar with those and start to understand what the different models that might suit them, you really might see some movement there. You mentioned the Empowerment Scholarship Account as one program that can help support families who might be considering, some of these different alternatives. The Empowerment Scholarship Account or Education Savings Account, ESAs, it's a program that the Goldwater Institute actually pioneered back in 2011 here in Arizona. Several other states now have modeled programs after that, so trying to find ways for that to be an opportunity that's there for students around the country. If you can talk a little bit about what that experience as an ESA mother yourself and how those families have dealt with that and how that program has been helpful, especially during this time and in general.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of exciting things to share about the ESA program right now, too. So the ESA program, for those who aren't familiar, it allows students who qualify to receive a portion of the state dollars for their child's education. So the parents then manage that scholarship and can use them for, a private school or a home learning environment with tutors, therapists, curriculum, and so forth. There are different qualifying categories for students to get on that scholarship. So some of those categories are kids with an IEP, a MET, or a 504 plan. So some sort of learning disability or special need. Military families, kids that are on a tribal reservation, kids who are attending a D or F rated school, and so on. So for those families who were receiving an empowerment scholarship, who were utilizing a private education for their kids, they did have to deal with some of the same challenges and some of the, same things that regular families had to deal with COVID-19 and private schools closing and making adjustments to learn at home. So the transition itself home was, a challenge, just like most people in some ways. For families who are utilizing the ESA with their kids already at home right now, like our family, the transition was a lot easier. And there has been, little to no disruption in services for our kids and for a lot of the other ESA families that, we've been talking to. Some tutors and therapists, of course, did take breaks for several weeks, and that might have been difficult, but a lot of those are starting to restart. And I think having tutors and therapists already set up for our kids, that made the transition easier too. We didn't have to come home and then find someone who could, serve our kids for the different things that they needed. Those things were already set up, and it was just a matter of maybe stopping for a few weeks and starting back up. But the other advantage, of course, is just the funding that we have for the curriculum, curriculum and books and, manipulatives for math and those types of things, they can be extremely expensive. So many parents who had to bring their kids home from a traditional school environment, parents without an ESA, they, like all parents, found themselves looking for ways to supplement their kids' education or look for new ways to help them, like maybe purchasing something to help with math facts or, ordering Handwriting Without Tears as a monthly subscription so their kids could practice, keyboarding or workbooks or whatever. But for those families that already had an empowerment scholarship, we were able to go right ahead and get those tools and purchase those things that we needed. But for a lot of those other families, that those expenses were coming out of their own pocket. And of course, there's the time spent trying to figure out what do I get, what's best and those types of things. But it definitely was a relief for those 7,000 plus ESA families that already were on the scholarship. And just a quick note on that topic. So currently we have about 7,000 to 7,500 families on the empowerment scholarship. The number shifts some because some families leave and go back to a traditional school environment while other families are always applying, because you can apply at any time during the year. There's just certain deadlines for funding. So May 15th, just a couple weeks ago, was the last deadline for the ESA applications to start funding this fall 2020-2021 school year. And we saw, according to the Arizona Department of Education, over 2,200 new applications come through for the empowerment scholarship here in Arizona. So that is a significant increase, over 30%. 880 of those applications were just in May alone. So that's exciting to me, because what that says is families are needing options and they're able to get on an ESA and utilize that option right now during a time when they need it the most. There's, here and there about 250,000 kids in Arizona alone who qualify for an empowerment scholarship. So I mentioned that just because some people are familiar with the ESA program. So if you or someone is looking for something different and maybe met some of those categories that we mentioned above, make sure to tell them. I saw, on a group just 2 days ago, a parent talking about a child that had a 504 plan and trying to figure out what they were going to do in the fall. And, we were able to say, hey, you're in Arizona. Have you heard about ESA? And she was like, oh my gosh, tell me about this. So make sure to, mention it to your friends and to your family, because sometimes people just don't know it's an option.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that's a program that parents and families can apply for anytime. So even if they aren't there for that first round of funding, they could still apply for this upcoming year and get into that program as an option for their students. So, well, obviously one of the main pieces for something like the ESA program is to have sort of the policy underpinning that at the legislative level for states to create that opportunity for parents and for families. Again, Arizona very fortunate to have this program, as of the other states that have passed it. So one of the interesting questions that I think we're going to be facing is, what do we see with policies like this going forward? Again, we've talked about some of the polling numbers of parents really looking for options, expressing interest in choice and alternatives and different models to serve their students. And so it's kind of an open question at this point in terms of what are we going to see states and legislators really do to respond to this? And I think it seems like we might have some sort of countervailing forces here. You have, on the one hand, potentially you have kind of the establishment sort of winning out a little bit and almost consolidating kind of control. Again, you have those cases where if private schools begin to struggle a little bit from their funding, or if charter operators are locked out, you might end up with actually less choice for families. On the flip side, again, you see a huge increase in parents being interested. And I think this is something that Goldwater and other groups trying to make the argument to policymakers that not only do these programs serve parents, serve students, and actually accommodate their individual needs, but even from a mere policy and fiscal perspective, these programs tend to be beneficial to the state. These are offering opportunities to families at generally a fraction of what public school expenses would be. And so, especially when you start to have private schools in danger of closing down, if that happens and a lot of those students work their way back to the public school system, that's exacerbating potentially, the budget situation that states are already facing. And so, to the extent that legislators and policymakers can internalize that groups like EdChoice, Excel and Ed have done a lot of work to really kind of quantify this and show if you have lots of students going out of these alternative models, you're actually going to kind of aggravate the system. And so hopefully you can see some momentum there on the policy side as well, as parents demand it, and economic need really suggests this can be something that's helpful in that sense as well. So I want to talk a little bit about online schools. Obviously we've seen a lot of families and schools adjusting quickly to it. What do you see in terms of the growth on the online side? And we talked about homeschooling and some of these others. What do you see on that side?
Well, I definitely think we'll see a growth in online education. The background in online education, online schooling is interesting. So for the past maybe 12 to 13 years, online schooling for kinder to 12th grade has been on the rise. There was some minor slowing in 2019, but tracking some of those things can be kind of tricky because there are full-time online schools, there's blended models, public online schools, private online schools, and so forth. But I think overall, with what's happening right now with COVID-19 and crisis schooling, all this, I do think we will see more families and schools switch to online options. That's kind of already happened. And while the transition early on was difficult for schools and parents, families are gaining familiarity with how these online options work. You mentioned earlier about schools working to find ways to give, internet access to, areas that didn't have access, and even things like, laptops or iPads. We interviewed a gal from Arizona early on who was teaching at a Title I school, and she was sharing about the things they're doing with the parents to make sure that the kids have, access to the online curriculum that they need. Arizona already does have some full-time online options. There's, Sequoia Choice or Arizona K-12. Those are more full-time school options. But I think the one thing that's important to mention about online schooling, and we've done online schooling before for our kids through an online charter here in Arizona, is that, the child is not in front of a computer all day. I think that's kind of what we think about it. That's at least what I thought about it until we did it. There was a lot of check-in. There were online lectures and classes that we could pop into or pop out of. There was some testing that was done online, but a good amount of the curriculum was, mailed to us, and we were able to, work through that with our kids. So even within online schooling, right, there's going to be more choices and options for families, which I think is outstanding. There's some other neat supplemental options too in regards to online schooling that we've tried. And I know a lot of parents out there have told me they've tried and loved. One of those is just OutSchool. So I'm not sure if you've heard of OutSchool, but for those who haven't heard about it, people who are, experts in certain fields or have an interest in a certain study can put together a course, register and put it up on OutSchool, and parents can go through these different class options and enroll their child. So, my 7-year-old, during this whole time took a 2-day class on the respiratory system, which he's super interested in, from a professional in Canada, and that was just really neat. That was the first time we'd done that. And so now that we've done that, even I'm more open to go, okay, what are some things you're interested in? What are some ways we can supplement what you're already doing with some of these other really neat courses? Khan Academy, of course, which I feel like a lot of people were already utilizing Khan Academy, so maybe we were late to the game. But we utilized Khan Academy for the first time in these last few weeks. And my son, who's really interested in coding, used their coding curriculum. And that was really neat to see too. There's a gal who's on there who shares, the teacher, she shares the video and she talks through what to do, and then the student pauses it, then they can interact and do the coding. So just so many neat options. But I kind of think in conclusion on the online thing, there are a variety of factors and concerns that parents have. I do think we will see more schools utilize online options. I think that is a great thing for students in Arizona and across the US. And ultimately that's because, loving families know what's best for their kids. So if that's an online option and they've tried it and they love it, then that's kind of a win-win for everyone.
I want to ask one more question before we kind of turn it over for the Q&A. And again, we'll give the information for that for folks who would like to submit a question. But I think one of the areas that have been weighing on people a little bit is in terms of, obviously students have been out of school, and so what the impact is on their learning, those gaps in learning, instruction that maybe isn't taking place. What do you see in terms of students being behind or not, and kind of the next steps forward and the way to approach that?
Sure. Well, students falling behind and what we're calling achievement gaps is a significant concern for families, for teachers, for everybody involved, in the education conversation. I know that some schools are looking to provide or already are providing supplemental, education for students through summer school options, or even preparing in the fall for additional ways that they'll be able to help the students that really need the help. And all of this, I think, is an excellent idea. We always need more options, and parents need to be able to utilize those options for their kids who might need them. One thing that we know is that when there is a crisis, we are forced to adapt, right? So in New Orleans, there was a massive upheaval in education after Hurricane Katrina. And Douglas Harris wrote about this. He wrote an article for Brookings, actually, in late April that I read. And he writes about all the changes there because of school zones not working anymore, and ultimately how parents got used to and liked having more choices for their kids, having more options. So it would seem that families now will also get used to some elements of online instruction or more non-traditional ways of supplementing their child's education. And I think that will help with what we're talking about regarding the concern with the achievement gap. And that idea alone, again, about, in a crisis we're forced to adapt, that just makes me really optimistic about what students may accomplish during this time. I mean, anyone listening, probably already is pretty aware that I'm very optimistic, in general about what's happening because of the innovation that we're seeing. And I know there's a lot of different voices and views on the issue. And schools and parents, need to be aware. We need to respond quickly and provide ways and pathways for students who are going to be struggling. But, remember, every summer we've had concerns for decades about what we call the summer slide, right? Where students might forget what they learned, during the school year, during the summertime when they're off. And there's mixed research, right, on the summer slide. I mean, there's scholars who would have a lot to say kind of on that topic. And so the conclusions might be mixed. But I think that the incredible response from schools and teachers and parents during this time is something that we should be optimistic about and excited about. My kids have discovered incredible opportunities from learning online. Other parents and schools have discovered these incredible opportunities for learning online. You know, museums and schools and universities and scholars are all just sharing their information. So I will continue to remain optimistic about the achievement gaps, only because I know how much everybody cares about this issue, and that parents and schools are going to do their best to try to meet the needs of those kids who may have fallen behind.
Well, I think especially in a time like today with a lot of concern and anxiety, your optimism, I think, is a breath of fresh air. So appreciate that. Well, wonderful. We'll turn it over then to the Q&A a little bit. Again, for folks who would like to submit questions, feel free to send us an email, events@goldwaterinstitute.org. You can also call us 602-633-8975 for that line. We have gotten a few questions already, so I'll read this one we have. Are there any examples of success stories of schools that reopened up this spring? If so, what health and safety protocols did they have in place? That's a great question. Obviously, schools sort of across the country, states taking different approaches initially, but it's essentially closed throughout the country. There have been a couple of states that have given some leeway to districts to revisit that. Montana has actually allowed its districts. So you had, especially in kind of more rural, small areas, of schools opening up in different ways. There was a day where they did open up for enrollments. They did things like study halls where they would have students come in, taking different precautions. This was, and I think one of the things that was good is they surveyed parents in advance actually, and tried to gauge sort of the temperature and see what is it that parents are comfortable with. Again, trying to be responsive, I think, to those local desires. I think, rather than just making an ironclad policy from one direction or the other, from on high from Washington or elsewhere, I think really trying to be in touch with what are the parents and the families looking for, I think was a great step. I know over there they were still trying to take precautions, getting large amounts of disinfectant and things to make sure the facilities are cleaned. Over in Sweden, I know they took a slightly different approach in terms of not closing schools for grade levels in the same way. They've had, among a higher but not the highest mortality rates for COVID, so it's kind of a different approach there, but they have successfully, kept the schools open in that sense, and doing things like trying to stagger the classrooms, have students again find creative ways, which seem to be a lot of the advice that the CDC is giving. Again, governors and the states are going to be certainly trying to handle this, kind of on a case by case in the fall, but trying to find ways to reopen to the extent possible and make sure that there are alternatives so that families who do feel comfortable, have that as an option or interested in something else can look there. So, all right, some other questions that we have. Are there other states that are on the verge of passing ESA type programs? How many states currently have ESAs? I don't know if Jenny, if you want to jump in on that, or I can talk a little bit about kind of on the policy front there. Arizona, again, being the first, several other states have followed suit. Tennessee, Florida, there's 5 in total. Tennessee right now actually has expanded their program this spring. And unfortunately, it has gone to a court challenge. Opponents of school choice have essentially tried to challenge it on grounds to say that it is not in keeping with the state constitution, because they made it available for students in 2 of the main metropolitan areas. And so people came out and said, well, we think that this is not serving everybody equally, even though this was really trying to be a compromise. And so, it's unfortunate that even the legislators in some of these areas who are trying to find ways to at least provide the opportunity to some students have gotten pushback. That's not to say, though, that we haven't made progress. Even in Arizona, we obviously had the legislation earlier this year to protect the families who were in our ESA program out on the Indian reservations, many of whom were, in jeopardy of losing access to that program. And so legislators, I think, have taken notice and tried to make sure that those opportunities are there for students.
And I think that parents need to remember how important they are in the process, of getting something like an ESA implemented in their state. We did a podcast several weeks ago, and I received several messages. We Love Your School was on, someone else's podcast, and I got several messages from parents saying, what is this empowerment scholarship thing that you're talking about, and how do I get one in my state? I think that particular person inquiring was from Texas, and I, sent information. but just that idea that when parents hear about these options, they want them, they're exciting. The thought of being able to do something for their child and put them in an environment that works for their child is very, very appealing. So just a reminder for all the parents who are listening who may not be in a state with something like an ESA, you have the power and the ability to start demanding and requesting and talking about these types of things for your state, because it's not just for individual families, right? It can benefit so many other students that need it.
Yeah. What is the Goldwater Institute or Love Your School doing to support these different types of options? So, Jen, if you want to talk a little bit about some of the work that you guys are doing at Love Your School.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're really doing is talking about these options, right? Trying to tell as many people everywhere that we can, at least for our purposes right now here in Arizona, so from north to south, east to west, hey families, these are your choices. Did you know about, the charter school option? Do you know about STOs and how your family can possibly, utilize an STO for private education? Are you aware that you might qualify for an ESA? Oh, you're thinking about homeschooling. Here are all these resources, right? AFE in Arizona, the Arizona Federation of Home Educators. Here are all these ideas and options and people that can help you do what you want to do for your child, put them in an educational environment that works for them. So that's just a huge part of what we're doing, is celebrating those options and making sure that we can reach every family in our state so that they know what their options are. That's why we love what we do, right? And we do it with just a lot of excitement and anticipation, because it's whatever option works for you. I don't mind if your family is in a district school or charter school, public, whatever. I don't think anybody does. What we want is for the family to have their child in the environment that works best. And that may be what they have right now, but they need to at least know their options so that they can make an informed choice. And making informed choices when it comes to our child's education is crucial.
Yeah, and I think that that's a piece that's incredibly important. You have done spotlights on families, on students, on different modes and opportunities to make sure that families are aware of, what options they have, and seeing other families who thrive in these environments. And I think that's hugely important. That complements, over at Goldwater, we kind of take the fight on sort of the policy grounds, working to, support the programs down at the legislature. We have, litigation in defense of the families in the ESA program. Taking sort of the media and political circles to task on, some of these analyses they've done that have, been trying to take shots at charter schools and to say, hey, look, a lot of these schools are really serving these students most in need, and in many cases more effectively than some of the traditional public schools that have maybe served those students as well. And so, I think it's great to have, and again, that's why it's so wonderful to be able to join with you here and kind of have everything from the policy side, litigation, communication, and everything to work with these families. And those efforts are just something that I think are hopefully small silver linings in a very uncertain time. So we had a question about homeschooling in terms of states that are restrictive or less restrictive. I don't know if you have a take on that. In Arizona, there's been kind of a history where homeschooling, as you mentioned, certainly has a rich history throughout the country. There have been kind of court battles and litigation around what are the rights of parents. And I think we've actually seen some positive movement on that in recent years to make sure that parents do have that authority to do it. There's requirements in different states about you must provide an education to students must attend schools. And I think you've actually seen some movement in states toward this idea of, we trust parents, we want them to be doing it. At this point, every parent, or the vast majority, are now homeschooling their students in some capacity. And so I think you're starting to see that. And there is a bit of a spectrum in terms of states that are more and less conducive to that. But I think places like Arizona, really have taken the ball on that. So let's see, we have a couple, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would love to add to that. I mean, we have seen, some differing opinions, across the nation lately on, homeschooling and how it works and whether it's good or bad or whatever. But I think it's important that we just reiterate one thing, and we have to do it over and over and over again. And that's to say that loving families always know what's best for their children, right? We know what educational environment is best for our children. And I think that anytime that we can reduce barriers to entry when it comes to our child's education, that's the direction that we should lean in. Why do we want to make it harder for families to do something that they think is going to be best for their kids regarding home education. So we have friends on the East Coast, got a text message, a couple weeks ago talking about home education and the list in their particular state of the things that have to be done. I saw that, having been here in Arizona, and thought, gee, that is kind of overwhelming. It concludes with them having to actually meet with a state regulator, over the work that has been done over the past year, and that's kind of scary and daunting, no matter who you are. So I think that when it comes to homeschooling, states like Arizona, with very little to low regulation, we essentially kind of register and sign an affidavit. Well, we're on ESA, but parents that do homeschool have to register and sign an affidavit about, what they will teach their kids, like what core subjects. But the rest is left up to the parent, as it should be. And so we just need to keep reminding parents about their importance and their eternal rights about, educating their children, because they know what's best for their kids.
We got another question. I'm troubled by the suggestion that teachers could coach and support parents teaching children at home. Teachers study for 2 years to learn to be teachers. Some go on to get master's degrees. How and why would they transmit this learning to parents, many who have no secondary education?
So, it's kind of funny. I was talking to someone the other day who is a substitute teacher here in Arizona, finishing their degree on something, and they got, whatever emergency licensing is here in Arizona in order to be able to do that. And in conversation with this individual who's had 20 plus years of experience in their field, we were kind of chuckling back and forth, and he made the comment, yeah, Bill Gates couldn't even, teach the class I'm teaching. He doesn't have this degree, this certification, this whatever. Steve Jobs couldn't have done that, even though he's got all this experience. He didn't have a degree in this, a certification in this, and so on and so forth. So the more that we can have teachers, individuals that are, of course, licensed and experienced to teach what they're teaching is, what we want. But I don't think we should ever discount, right, people that have life experience in certain fields and have done so for years and years and years. Goldwater Institute, you guys have done all sorts of work on licensing reform in different states and things like that. I think that's really important, and maybe at some point it will spill over into education as well, because there are a lot of people who are extremely bright, who have various different degrees, but maybe they don't have the specific licenses that they need right now to teach, but they teach and get those things maybe later on. So I don't know what the answer is, but I always want to be more open when it comes to education and looking at the value that people can add or contribute to someone's education, whether it's their own child's or somebody else's.
Yeah, I think very well answered. One more question. We talked a lot about homeschool, micro schools, et cetera. Are these accessible to families who are struggling or low income? And I think, we've touched on this a little bit with a lot of these, there's always a concern about, well, are private schools or alternative models only something that's a feature for wealthier families? And I think that's a narrative that's out there a lot. And so I think, we can maybe both touch on this one a little bit, but I think, we mentioned stuff like the Success Academy, charter schools serving low income students, research that Goldwater's put out on the ESA program, that lower income students, whether they're in kind of urban areas like the Roosevelt District and kind of urban Phoenix or out on rural Indian reservations, seeing this really changing lives. We did some case studies on that, showing that in some of these low income areas, for example, like Roosevelt, the ESA amount would cover the tuition at 4 out of the 5 local private schools near them, right? So even if you're a student from a family who doesn't necessarily have the means to then supplement that with a lot of extra funding, these are opening up doors to these families to pursue these options.
Absolutely. And I think that, low income families deserve to have options. Right? No longer should we be saying that you are limited to what you can do for your child's education because of where you live, because of your zip code, because of your income. And that is what educational freedom, that is what school choice provides for families across the income spectrum, right? So for an empowerment scholarship, like you said, in the Roosevelt District, there are private schools where an empowerment scholarship, if a child qualifies, let's say they've got the 504 plan or they're at a D or F school, where they can utilize that ESA to go to a private school. Look at STOs. We've got to mention those. There are opportunities for low-income families, and I think there's even specific scholarships that give additional funding when it comes to STOs for low-income families. So there are, in Arizona at least, a variety of ways that school choice advocates have created more opportunity for low-income families versus the only option is their locally zoned school. So families need to know about those options, and that's the most important thing, I think, for everybody out there for Love Your School, is that if families don't know about these options, then they don't have the opportunity to utilize them. And that's why, we need to shout from the rooftops what school choice is, what educational freedom is, and how parents can better access these things. There was that movie that came out recently that some people may or may not have seen, Miss Virginia. And it talks all about how Virginia Walden Ford in Washington, D.C. wanted her child to go to a private school and couldn't afford it. And of course, now there are empowerment scholarship type opportunities there for kids to access a private education. That is what families deserve. That is what every family, low income families included, deserve, is the opportunity to put their child, in an educational environment where they can thrive.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And you touched on one other thing I would just add to, in terms of these opportunities to make sure that the families of all means have it. You mentioned tax credits, for example, the Florida tax credit, which was reviewed by the Urban Institute recently. It's a left-leaning think tank, and they found, this program, which serves, again, mostly low-income students, had positive gains for students going to college. And so, these programs are open in different states and to different groups of students. In Arizona, there's different versions of it, for some for low income, some for students with disabilities, some for just students more broadly. And I think bringing these programs to bear so that they're there to offer support. I think one of the big struggles that we've seen, and we talked about this a little bit, is if going forward, you only have sort of a one model that continues to get funding through guaranteed, state funding formulas through public traditional district schools. That's sort of picking winners and losers in a way that I don't think is helpful. And so being able to talk about these other programs, to make sure that there's support for them, encourage legislators, policymakers, folks on the ground, and parents to know about them, I think, really will help ensure that, all the different types of schooling that you guys at Love Your School really try to promote and bring information about are actually able to thrive and flourish. So, I think that'll be encouraging. So, well, Jenny, I think that'll do it for us for today. I want to thank you so much. If folks do have other questions that you'd like us to answer, again, feel free to shoot us an email, events@goldwaterinstitute.org, or again, the number you can call us for that would be 602-633-8975. So, Jenny, thank you so much. If anyone is interested, please always check out the Goldwater website if you're interested in supporting us or going to Love Your School. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and all the best.